I remember my brother's eyes, the way they glinted with a strange, sort of malice even, when we were just kids. Growing up under the same roof, we were supposed to have each other's backs, to be family first, but for as long as I can remember, he made sure I knew that family could hurt you worse than any stranger could. When I was 8, I loved animals, especially the small ones. I'd begged our parents to let me keep a little golden hamster I'd named Timmy. Timmy was my world. I dotted on every day, carrying him around in my pockets and sneaking little pieces of my lunch to him. One day, I came home from school, eager to play with Timmy, only to find his cage empty. I searched everywhere, calling his name, panicking as each minute ticked by. Then I saw my brother, standing in the backyard with a smug grin, a little shovel in his hand. He had buried Timmy alive just to watch me suffer. And when I confronted him, sobbing, all he said was, "You should know by now that nothing you love is safe from me." As we got older, his schemes grew more vicious, and the stakes became higher. One winter, we were both around 12, and my brother dared me to walk across a frozen lake near our home. I knew the ice was thin, and I refused, but he wouldn't let it go. He taunted me, calling me a coward, promising he'd tell our friends I was weak. Scared little boy, against my better judgment, I did it. Step by step, I shuffled out onto the ice, my heart pounding with each crack beneath my feet. About halfway across, the ice gave way, and I plunged into the freezing water. I screamed, clawing at the jagged edges of the ice, trying to pull myself up. I'll never forget his laughter echoing as he watched me struggle, waiting until I was almost too weak to fight before finally helping me out. The smile on his face that day, it seared into my memory. But the worst thing he did came when we were teenagers. There was a girl in our school, Maria, who I had a massive crush on. I'd barely worked up the courage to talk to her, but one day, my brother found out. I didn't think much of it. Maybe he'd tease me, but I thought he'd leave it at that. I was wrong. One evening, he told me he'd invited Maria to our house and that she was waiting downstairs. My heart raced as I rushed to greet her, only to find my brother, sitting alone, grinning like he'd won some dark game. "She'll never come near you," he said. "I told her about your little obsession with her. She's creeped out now, thinks you're a freak." I couldn't believe he'd stooped that low, but when I saw Maria at school the next day, she looked at me with nothing but disdain. She never spoke to me again. Time passed, and I buried those memories, those scars, deeper and deeper. I threw myself into work, into building a life that was everything he wasn't. But memories of one moment from our childhood flooded back, the one that might have sparked his hatred toward me in the first place. It was a memory I'd almost forgotten, but I realized it might have been the seed that planted his resentment, twisting it over the years into something unrecognizable. We were about 6 years old, back when my brother and I were still close, or at least as close as two siblings could be. Our parents were busy with their work. They had demanding jobs and often left us in the care of a family friend, Mrs. Eliza, an older woman from our neighborhood. She was gentle and kind, always bringing us cookies or letting us help her bake. I loved Mrs. Eliza, and so did he, in his own way, though he never said it outright. One summer afternoon, Mrs. Eliza invited us to her garden to pick some tomatoes and carrots. She was a humble lady, living alone with her garden and a few chickens. As we knelt in the dirt, plucking the vegetables, she began to tell us stories, magical tales of fairies and enchanted woods. I was mesmerized, hanging on every word, and I saw my brother smiling. Genuinely for once, it was rare to see him that way, with no malice, just a boy listening to a story. But then something happened. A knock came at her door, and she left us in the garden to answer it. I took the opportunity to tell my brother a secret I'd been keeping, about how I'd saved my pocket money to buy him a toy car he wanted, one that he'd been begging our parents for. I thought it would make him happy, that he'd finally see that I cared about him, that I wanted to be his friend as much as his brother. But before I could finish, he noticed the basket of cookies Mrs. Eliza had left on the garden table. Without a second thought, he lunged for it, cramming cookies into his mouth, crumbs falling everywhere. I laughed, reaching for one too, and said, "Hey, save some for me." But then Mrs. Eliza came back outside, her face falling as she saw what he'd done. She scolded us both, assuming we'd both devoured the cookies without permission. I tried to explain that it was mostly him, but she wouldn't listen. She didn't want to hear us blame each other. "I'm so disappointed in you both," she said, her voice gentle but laced with sadness. "I trusted you." My brother's face changed then. A dark look crossed over it, something I couldn't quite understand at that age. He stared at me, his little fists clenched, eyes full of betrayal, as if I'd somehow taken something precious from him. When we left her house, he didn't say a word to me, and that silence stretched on for days. It was as though, in his mind, I had been the one who betrayed him, who had somehow ruined a bond he held with Mrs. Eliza. That day marked the first time I felt the venom in his gaze, the bitterness that seemed to grow and coil around his heart over the years. I'd forgotten about it, pushed it aside as a childhood misunderstanding. But to him, it must have festered, becoming the reason he despised me. It was as if he'd convinced himself that I'd destroyed something he cherished, and he was determined to make me pay for it over and over again. Looking back, it seemed like my brother was born with the ability to manipulate. Even as kids, he knew how to twist words and charm people in ways that always worked to his advantage. He didn't waste time learning to please our parents either. He became an expert in getting their attention, their approval, and, eventually, their unwavering favor. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was my big brother, after all, just a few years older, but somehow always more cunning, always 2 steps ahead. He'd get away with breaking our parents' rules or skipping chores, while I'd end up grounded for the smallest misstep. It didn't seem fair, but I was too young to understand what he was doing back then. But one memory stands out. The time he twisted things so badly that our parents not only blamed me for something I didn't do but rewarded him for coming clean. I was about 10 when it happened. Our parents had a prized vase, a family heirloom passed down through generations. It sat in the living room on display, and we were never allowed to go near it. One afternoon, my brother and I were playing indoors, throwing a foam ball back and forth, trying to see who could make the more difficult catch. My brother, of course, suggested we take it to the next level, throwing the ball over the vase, daring each other to catch it without knocking it over. I hesitated, sensing the danger, but he taunted me, calling me scared until I caved in. He tossed the ball too high, and I missed it. It bounced, hitting the edge of the table, and we watched, horrified, as the vase teetered and then crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. I froze, my heart racing. I knew our parents would be furious. But before I could think of what to do, he sprang into action. By the time our parents came home, he'd rehearsed his version of events perfectly. As soon as they walked in, he put on this tearful expression and started sobbing, telling them I had thrown the ball too high, even though he'd told me to be careful, and that I'd broken the vase in my recklessness. He told them he tried to warn me, even begged me to stop, but I wouldn't listen. The tears streaming down his face were so convincing that, despite my protests, our parents believed every word. They looked at me with disappointment and anger, and my mother, with tears in her eyes, shook her head and said, "Why couldn't you be more like your brother? He's responsible. He knows how to follow the rules." I was stunned. Even as I tried to explain, my brother just stood there, casting me a look that seemed to say, "No one will ever believe you." And he was right. Our parents didn't just believe him, they showered him with praise for his honesty, for owning up to his mistakes, and for being the good son. As punishment, I was grounded for a month, forbidden to go out or play with any of my friends. But my brother, he received a special dinner, a new game he'd been asking for, and a place in our parents' good graces that I would never have. That wasn't the only time he turned their favor against me. He'd perfected the art of whispering lies, carefully painting me as the troublemaker, the reckless one who couldn't be trusted. He'd break something, leave it lying around, then tell our parents he'd seen me with it earlier. Or he'd lie about his homework, claiming I distracted him, so they'd scold me for being inconsiderate. Slowly, he convinced them that he was the responsible son, the one who always tried to do the right thing, while I was the one who made things difficult, who was careless, who always needed guidance. As I grew older, I could feel the weight of their expectations and disappointment bearing down on me. But he thrived in it, manipulating our parents, love like it was his weapon. I could see it in the little things too. When report cards came home, he'd inflate his grades, bragging about his achievements, casting subtle jabs at me, calling me slow or lazy. And our parents would nod, pat him on the back, and tell me to learn from my brother. Years passed, and his hold on our parents only tightened. They never saw the malice behind his actions, never questioned his motives. To them, he was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and I was the disappointing second son, always trying to live up to a standard that was deliberately set, just out of reach. As much as I tried to escape him, life has a strange way of tying loose ends we'd rather leave frayed. Years after all those childhood betrayals, when I had left home, cut him off, and worked hard to build my life, I'd grown stronger in his absence, forged a path of my own, and built the life I dreamed of. Friends, a good job, and, eventually, a wife who felt like my soulmate. And that's when he showed up, out of the blue. He stood on my doorstep, awkward, his gaze cast down as if he couldn't bear to meet my eyes. I remember the hesitation, the way I held onto the doorframe, torn between slamming the door in his face and hearing what he had to say. "I know I've hurt you," he began, voice unsteady. He looked older, worn down somehow. I've been carrying things I need to make right." Part of me wanted to believe him, but I'd been burned too many times before. I crossed my arms and stared at him, waiting for the apology he clearly struggled to get out. I wanted to hear him say it, to admit what he'd done, all the harm he'd caused. And finally, he did. One by one, he laid out his faults, not even sparing himself from the darkest moments. He admitted to ruining my relationships in school, to lying to our parents, to the cruelty I'd endured from him. He went on and on, his voice barely above a whisper as he finally shouldered the weight he'd so long refused to carry. And for the first time, he looked genuinely vulnerable. He was the brother I remembered from before everything turned so twisted, the boy who was once my friend. "Please, I know I don't deserve it, but I need a chance to make this right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't have anyone else, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to be in your life. I want to be your brother again." A strange warmth filled my chest, a feeling I'd forgotten I could have toward him. Against all my instincts, I forgave him. Maybe it was out of exhaustion, or maybe because I wanted to believe people could change. I'd worked so hard to put those wounds behind me, and I thought that forgiving him would help me close the door on the past. We spent hours talking, sifting through memories both good and bad, until, by the end of the night, we laughed as brothers again. He started coming around more often after that, joining us for dinner with my wife, joking with her and making her laugh the way I hadn't seen in a long time. It felt strange at first, sharing my life with him, but he seemed different. His charm was still there, but it felt sincere this time, and my wife, bless her kind heart, welcomed him in without hesitation. She believed in family, in second chances, and I convinced myself that maybe, finally, he was learning to be a better man. The months passed, and he became like family to us. I'd let my guard down, truly believing he had changed. I never saw the small gestures, the glances they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. I was blind to the subtle ways he drew her in, making her laugh with private jokes or offering to help her with things that, in hindsight, were all calculated moves. At the time, I trusted him, never suspecting he'd use our newfound closeness as a way to get close to her. The night I discovered the truth was a quiet one. She had left her phone on the counter, and a message from him flashed on the screen. A simple, unassuming message. "I can't stop thinking about last night." That shattered everything in a single second. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I stared at the words, barely able to process what I was reading. I scrolled, my heart pounding, And there it was. A thread of messages that made it clear they'd been involved for months. I felt like I'd been plunged back into those childhood years, like all those painful memories had clawed their way back to the surface. He hadn't changed. He'd just found a way to hurt me even deeper than before, by taking the one person I thought I could trust completely. I stormed out that night, unable to look either of them in the eyes. The betrayal was suffocating, but worse than that was the realization that he'd never let go of whatever resentment he harbored for me. Even after all these years, he'd found a way to hurt me in a way he knew I might never recover from. After that night, the truth about their betrayal tore through me, consuming every thought. I left home in a rage, unable to face either of them. I drove for hours, letting the anger and betrayal twist inside me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. All I could think about was the betrayal, replaying every moment of the past few months, trying to understand how I could have missed it. My wife. My brother. It was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The next morning, I drove back home, numb but determined. I needed answers. When I arrived, the house was quiet, almost hauntingly so. My wife was sitting on the couch, her face pale, eyes red from tears. She'd been waiting for me. As I walked in, she opened her mouth, starting to say something, but I couldn't bear to hear it. I put up a hand, stopping her cold. "Don't," I said, my voice like ice. "I already know." I saw the guilt written all over her face, confirming what I'd read the night before. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I needed to know how deep this betrayal went. After she calmed down, I questioned her, each answer cutting deeper than the last. She admitted that they'd been seeing each other for months, that it had started innocently. Conversations, shared memories from the dinners we'd had together, inside jokes that grew into something darker. But there was something she wasn't telling me, a hesitation, something she was hiding even in her confession. I pressed her, my patience hanging by a thread, and finally, she broke down and admitted there was more. "I think," she began, her voice trembling, "I think I might be pregnant." The ground felt like it shifted beneath me. I was supposed to be happy, joyful, at the news of our first child. But this. My world imploded with that single word, because I couldn't shake the suspicion that gnawed at me. I needed to know if it was mine, or if this child belonged to him. Without a word, I left her there, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me as I drove to a clinic, demanding answers. I scheduled a paternity test. My wife begged for forgiveness, promised it would never happen again. But I couldn't listen. I couldn't look at her without feeling a sickening mix of rage and sorrow. Over the next few weeks, I pretended to forgive her, doing everything I could to keep the peace while I waited for the test results. My brother, of course, was nowhere to be found, avoiding me like a coward. I tried to keep up appearances, but every time I looked at my wife, the doubt gnawed at me. She was pregnant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that my own brother was the father of her child. Finally, the day of the test results arrived. My hands shook as I opened the envelope, each heartbeat echoing in my ears as I read the result. The confirmation felt like a blade driven straight into my heart. He was the father. Everything I'd worked for, the family I'd envisioned, the life I'd tried so hard to build away from my brother's shadow. It was all a lie. He hadn't just betrayed me, he'd stolen everything from me, left a wound so deep I wasn't sure it could ever heal. The day I handed my wife the divorce papers, I felt a strange kind of relief. After everything she and my brother had done, I tried to find some way to forgive, but I knew I couldn't stay. She had shattered everything we'd built together, and I couldn't imagine a future where I would ever trust her again. Her face crumpled as she looked down at the papers, but I didn't feel pity anymore. It was over. After that, I did my best to pick up the pieces of my life. I buried myself in work, in friendships I'd neglected, in anything that could help me forget what my brother and ex-wife had done. But then, a few weeks later, I got a call from my father, asking me to come by the family home. His voice was tense, the kind of tone he only used when something serious was going on. I felt a sickening suspicion that somehow, this was connected to her. When I arrived, there she was, my ex-wife, standing in the living room with tears in her eyes, pleading with my father to talk to me, to convince me to take her back. She painted herself as the victim, saying she'd been confused, that she was lost, and had made a terrible mistake. She spun a tale about how much she missed our life together, how she wanted to make things right, and how devastated she was by the divorce. My father's face was hard, his jaw clenched as he listened to her. He looked over at me, confusion clouding his eyes. "She tells me you won't forgive her," he said. I kept my voice steady as I replied. "Forgive her for what, exactly? For betraying me with my own brother? For destroying our marriage and lying to me every day? Or for carrying my brother's child?" Silence fell over the room like a thunderclap. My father's eyes widened, the gravity of the situation dawning on him. He looked at my ex-wife, who stood there speechless, unable to deny the truth any longer. She stumbled through some excuses, trying to justify what had happened, but my father cut her off. He began slowly, as though the pieces were finally coming together in his mind. "You said my older son was responsible for what went wrong, that he was the victim all those years. And I believed him." His voice cracked slightly, and I saw the conflict in his eyes. The pain of realizing he'd been deceived, that he'd chosen to believe one son while blindly casting the other aside. Finally, he turned back to me, his gaze heavy with regret. "All this time you were innocent, weren't you?" He lowered his head, as if ashamed to even look at me. "I can't believe it took me this long to see it." The room felt stifling as the silence stretched on. "I've made a mistake," he said, his voice gruff, a mixture of shame and anger. "I spent years trusting the wrong son, overlooking everything you went through, because I thought you were the problem." He shook his head. "Your mother and we were blind, and I see now that we can't undo what's been done." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I made my decision about the inheritance years ago, but I see now that I owe you far more than I ever realized. You built your life on your own, without the advantage we could have given you because I didn't trust you to do right by us. And I was wrong." He turned to my ex-wife, his face hardening. "I can't forgive you for what you did, and I won't stand by while you drag my son's life through the mud." With a heavy sigh, he reached into his pocket and handed me a document. I glanced down, my heart pounding as I read the terms. 10 million in inheritance, my father's attempt at making amends for the years of neglect, the betrayal, the pain. "I don't want you to ever doubt your place in this family again," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You've earned every bit of this and more. As for your brother, he's no longer my son. I gave him everything, and he repaid me by tearing this family apart. I won't make the same mistake again." I stared at him, my throat tight with emotion. Years of anger, resentment, and heartbreak all swirled inside me, but beneath it, there was a strange sense of peace. My father had finally seen the truth, and he was trying, however late it was, to make things right. My ex-wife left, defeated, realizing she had no one left to turn to. And as for my brother, well, he had lost everything.